the opportunity to be here. I do know several of you, and I'm getting to know more of you as I peruse through the crowd and hang out with some of you folks. It's been, I've always wanted to come to Roebuck, never had an opportunity. You know, when you work for a church, you very rarely get opportunities to go somewhere and visit. So it's nice to be here, and I appreciate the opportunity to speak with you tonight. My topic that I've been given is a family that is pleasing to God. And before I move any further, I need to send greetings from Kyle and Jamie Massengale and their family. They love you guys very much. I know you know that already, but he wanted me to make sure and let you guys know that they still think about you and miss you very much. So we're going to talk about a family that is pleasing to God. And you know, families come in all shapes and sizes, and there are a lot of different things that make up the family. But I believe there are some things that we can draw from the Scriptures that will help us maybe identify the things that are important with regard to how to please God and build a family that is pleasing to Him. You know, I guess there's probably a way to turn this into about a 6-hour lesson if you really wanted to. And I tried to scale it down to an hour and a half. So I've been told there's a big hook and a trap door, and I hope to not have to use either one of those, but we'll try to move through this pretty quickly. A family pleasing to God. Let me start with this. A family that is pleasing to God keeps God as a focal point. I think about some of the passages that we've got listed up here on the board. Do you know that Psalms 138 verse 2 says that there are two things that are elevated above everything else on earth? It's God's name and God's Word. That's pretty important for us to remember that is a primary focus, and that those two things are elevated above everything else on earth. Psalm 119 verse 11, the Bible tells us that the Bible is so important that it can even help us fight off sin. The psalmist said, your word I have treasured in my heart, or I've hidden in my heart that I might not sin against you. And then in verse 105 of that same chapter, chapter 119, the Bible says that God's Word is a lamp to our feet and a light to our path. And so, that's a neat image for us to understand, that it's something that helps light the path, helps guide us through the things that are going on in our lives. And then if you go to verse 160, it simply says that the sum of your word is truth. So we're blessed in that God has given us His Word that'll help us live for Him and help us to know what we need to do to be pleasing to Him. But it kind of filtered down through the ages. And what we saw is later Paul was passing on information to Timothy. And you remember in 2 Timothy 2, verse 2, he says, the things that you've seen and heard and witnessed in me, those same things commit to faithful men who will be able to teach others also. But then just a chapter later, in chapter 3 of 2 Timothy, he says this. He says, from a child, Timothy, you've known the Holy Scriptures, which are able to make you wise unto salvation. All Scripture is given by inspiration of God, and is profitable for doctrine, for reproof, for correction, for instruction in righteousness, that the man of God may be complete, perfectly furnished unto every good work. So the Bible is given to us so we can know what God's will is for our life, and that's important for us to make sure that we're keeping that as a focal point in our family. But not only are we to understand that that's a focal point, God's Word, but really putting our trust in God as a focal point. And that perhaps sometimes is a little bit more challenging. Think about all the struggles that we go through from time to time. Think about the temptations that we have. Think about the ups and the downs of life. And we know that God told us that Jesus came to give us life and to give it to us abundantly. But sometimes that roller coaster is just a little bit too much for us. But I think the words in Proverbs 3, verses 5 and 6 really should help us. You think about the words there. Trust in the Lord with all your heart, and don't lean on your own understanding. In all your ways, acknowledge Him, and He'll make your paths straight. I love that text. It's one of my favorite in all the Bible. In fact, I'll say it is my favorite passage in all the Bible because I can find a way to apply that verse in just about any situation. You're going through a difficult time, trust in God. Know that He's got it. You're going through a time of depression, trust in God. He's going to help you through that. No matter what may come our way, the victories, the failures, it doesn't matter. Because ultimately, God is in control. And we've got to find a way to teach our family that and to keep them aware of that. John chapter 3, verse 16. Not only is God one that we can trust in, but God is one that loves us. And that makes it so much easier for us to place our trust in Him. When you think about what it says that God loved the world so much that He sent Jesus to die for us, to pay the penalty for our sin. And all the mistakes that we've made in our lives, those things can be blotted out because of Jesus' blood on the cross in our obedience to Him. And then in Acts chapter 17, verse 28, when Paul is talking to the people there on Mars Hill, and he says, this God that you worship in ignorance, this is the God. In Him we live and we move and we have our being. So God is something that is a being that we need to have as a focal point in our families. And if we're going to be pleasing to God, we've got to show that He is first and foremost. Let me see if I can illustrate how that works, even in my family growing up. My father was a USDA food inspector. We called him a chicken plucker. All right? He also preached on the side, if that's even possible, you know. And my father, he just didn't have a lot of money. We had 4 kids in our family. I'm one of 4. And sometimes money got really tight. And if you had some kind of crisis that happened, and you know how this works in your own family, when something happens and the rest of the money goes, you're left with nothing. And my parents weren't able to put a lot in savings, and they weren't able to put a lot away. So it was really and truly tough sometimes. And I remember this. My dad brought us as a family into the living room, and he said, I need to talk to all of you. He said, we got a challenge. And he showed us the checkbook. And he showed us the balance. He said, this is where I subtract everything, and this is where I come up with the balance. And the balance was $1.27. So that's all we have right now. So I need your help. Until I get paid again, you're going to have to help around here. Please don't ask us to stop by the gas station and pick up a snack. Please don't ask us to take you somewhere to eat. Please don't ask us for any money for any kind of activity at school. Please don't ask us for anything, because right now we have $1.27. And so I said to my dad, knowing that giving to church was really, really important, I said, well, Dad, what about Sunday, like contribution? You know, you've always said that comes first. And he says, oh, no, that check's already written and it's put aside. We'll be okay till I get paid next week. That money's laid aside. So you know how this goes in a kid's mind, right? I start, you know, the wheels are turning a little bit, and I say, well, hey, Dad, so what you're saying is we actually do have more money, right? And if we just use that, we could go to Burger King, right? But Dad said, listen, that's not how this works. You know, God gets the first fruits. I've always said that, and we're going to practice it. That check is written. It's ready to go for church. We have $1.27. So we were supposed to go to the cupboard and eat whatever was in there. And, you know, it's like leftover cans of hominy from like 1964, which who eats that stuff anyway? But so we go in there, and we're eating our food and everything, and we're all kind of upset. And I'm like, but Dad, we could do that and then just double up the next week in contribution. And my dad said, that's not how we're going to do things. God gets first. So we're miserable for 3 or 4 days. And then all of a sudden, my dad calls us back into the living room, and he says, you guys remember when I told you that you didn't need to worry, that God would take care of us? He said, you're not going to believe this, but today I got a check from our insurance company. We've been overcharged in premiums for about 2 years, and we just got a refund check that more than covered the shortfall. Now, I'm not saying God writes checks from the skies and pours them into the insurance agencies for your benefit when things like that go wrong. But what I am saying to you is that putting our trust in God and making Him a focal point, no matter what the situation, proved to all of us that God was going to take care of us and be in control. God's got to be the focal point of your family. But also, a family that's pleasing to God redeems the time. You know, in Ephesians chapter 5, verses 1 through 16, there's a lot of talk about walking the way God would have us to walk. And so it talks a little bit about us, you know, walking worthy of the calling. It talks about us, you know, stepping out of the darkness and into the light. And it talks about how it's important for us to be an example and to be what we should be. It tells us to not sleepwalk, to wake up and to be alert. And then when you get into verse 15, it says, So see then that you walk circumspectly. And when I think about this terminology, even just from an English standpoint, the idea here is circum, okay, like circum. I think about looking around in a circular fashion. Spectly, watching carefully. So when it says to walk circumspectly, what I see is a person who takes their time, who looks at all around them. If you've ever been out somewhere in the woods in the dark and you don't know where you're stepping and you could find something that you don't need to, and you're very careful about where you place your foot. The idea here is being purposeful, about being very deliberate about what you do. So in our Christian walk, we're supposed to be very careful about how we step and how we live. And it says by doing that, we redeem the time. Now, every child knows what redeeming means because they've gone to Chuck E. Cheese. You know how this works, right? You pay, $600 and get 10 tokens and get 4 million tickets, and then you come out with a half-cent plastic spider ring or something, you know? But our kids understand that when they win these games, they get these tickets, and then they go up to the counter and they redeem those tickets for items that they want, some kind of prize. Well, the idea here is to buy back, okay? Redeem, that word, buy back. But not in the sense of we can make more time than there is. I mean, I hear people say, you just need to make more time. We can't make more time. We got to take the time that we're given and do what we can with it. But I think that's the point of this passage is that if we walk carefully, deliberately, purposefully, we can take advantage of the time that we have here. You know some of these passages, Job 9, 25 and 26, gives this allusion to how fast time is. It's like an eagle coming down and swooping up its prey. You know, and you think about how the Bible says we have about 70 years or so, and that's it. And then that time just is fleeting and it passes by. James chapter 4, verses 14 says that your life is like a mist. It's a vapor. Okay, it's here one moment and then it vanishes away. Time is short. But a family that pleases God, make sure that the priorities that are in place are the ones that are going to guide the family in a way that pleases God. So sometimes when you're watching a television show and your child or your grandchild or a nephew is around and they're asking for your attention, turn it off. Make them a priority. Make your relationships with people in your family important. That's hard. I've got 3. I've got a 13-year-old, bless my heart. I've got an almost 11-year-old, bless my heart. And I've got a 6-year-old, bless my heart. And they keep us hopping all the time. They keep us moving and going. And it's real easy to get home and just want to crash and fall out. But you know what? They don't run out of energy. Kids do not run out of energy. Did you know that? They don't, ever. And they're always needing your attention and your love. Don't let those days pass by without redeeming the time and making it worth the while. In Deuteronomy chapter 6, the Bible gives us some strong encouragement for us as fathers in particular, those of us who are heads of our house, to teach our children. And it says to teach our children when we rise up, when we lie down, when we walk by the way, when we sit at the table. In other words, every opportunity we have, we should be teaching God's principles. You know, I think back to back in the biblical times, what would happen is a father would go to work and he would take his sons with him and he would teach them the trade. And that trade would be something that they shared in common. And not only while he taught them the trade, but he would also spend some time helping teach him what God had to say. And so when the Industrial Revolution came around and we're all in manufacturing places and factories and workplaces and we've left home, then it leaves that gap of that time that we're really meant to use in training our children. So that makes that time that you have at home with them even more special and more important. Let's make sure that we give them the time that they need. But also, a family that's pleasing to God is one that honors God's model for marriage. Let me take you to Genesis chapter 2. But let's go there in our minds before we go in our Bibles. The Garden of Eden. How do you see the Garden of Eden? For me, I see beautiful greenery everywhere. You know, maybe kind of rainforest looking. a lot of trees, a lot of greenery, a lot of beautiful flowers. Basically, every imaginable beautiful flower that you see on earth, I can imagine it being all there for their viewing pleasure. And I can just see it just so beautifully. I imagine, that there's some shrubs and beautiful plants, and then there's, some big trees with big canopy of leaves. I can see sun rays flashing through. Off in the distance, I can see a waterfall cascading down into a nice little stream. I see a foot-trodden path. This is all in my own imagination, but I'm wondering what it must have looked like. And I think it was probably just the most magnificent sight ever. And it's under this backdrop that we read Genesis chapter 2. So when you read these passages, try to imagine what they must have seen and experienced and felt. And the scene in Genesis chapter 2 is when Adam has been given a responsibility to name all the animals. And you remember this, don't you? They came by and God says, whatever you want to call them is what they'll be. And so Adam began naming them. And somewhere along the way, God noticed that there was something maybe not quite right with Adam. And it says, it's not good that the man should be alone. And so you remember what happened. God caused Adam to fall into a deep sleep. And he took a rib from his side, and it says, fashioned a woman. Now again, I don't know how you see this in your mind, but as you're reading there in Genesis 2, I sort of see that backdrop of Eden. And I see that beautiful path, that foot-trodden path. Not a gravel or anything like that, but just where they must have walked together. And all of a sudden I see Adam, maybe from laying down, he sits up and maybe he's in a little bit of a daze. And off in the distance he hears some rustling of the trees and the bushes. And then the next thing he sees is God with perhaps the most beautiful thing ever witnessed in creation. A beautiful woman, fashioned perfectly, customized for him. And God walking her down the path and presenting her to Adam. Now, pause. If you've been to a wedding recently, you will understand what I'm about to explain to you. In our wedding ceremonies, we model this, don't we, just a little bit? Let's go there. The wedding party begins to come in. We have special music for the grandmothers and the mothers, and everybody's kind of escorted into the room. And you look up and the groom is up there. You didn't know it. He just sneaks up on stage and you're like, hey, he cleans up pretty good, right? And then all of a sudden, everything stops. And what happens when the bride comes in? Doors fly open. It's like butterflies are released. There's like a laser light show and vapors coming out everywhere. And she steps through the door and there's a collective gasp. And you can literally, if you're the minister and you've done this before, you can stand up here and watch it happen. Everybody's in awe of the bride, but everybody pivots. Literally, everybody in the crowd is standing and pivoting. She gets her own music. She gets her own entrance. Everybody in the world is looking at her. She's the most beautiful thing in the world. And guess what happens? The father takes her by the arm, walks her down the aisle, and presents her to the husband. I just think that's awesome. I think that what we do in our wedding ceremonies is such a picture of what took place there in the garden. And when Adam saw her, it went something like this. He says, look, that's bone like my bone and flesh like my flesh. She's made just like me. I'm going to call her woman because she came out of man. There is no way to describe the excitement and the joy that he must have experienced when he saw her. And in the same way, when a groom stands right here and waits for his bride to come in, and she opens that door and he sees her in all that beautiful white dress, you see them, they come up here, they crumble, they fall apart. Even guys who are not emotional cry like babies. Why? Because it's the greatest thing they've ever seen. And that's what Adam saw. And you can see him making her his own precious partner. Who would have ever thought that mankind would take that special gift and destroy it. I want you to notice what didn't happen on that day. What didn't happen is God make Adam fall asleep, take 2 ribs, make a male and a female, and walk both of them down the aisle and say, now you choose which one. Are you with me? Today, traditional marriage, biblical marriage, is under assault. Why? Because the devil's real. Because the devil has come in and perverted it. At the end of Genesis chapter 2, you know what it says? So a man shall leave his father and mother, and he shall be joined to his wife, and they two shall become one flesh. And then it says, and they were together naked and unashamed. See, before sexual perversions came into the picture, this was all a beautiful thing. And folks, please listen. We have got to share with our children what biblical marriage is all about. We have got to model it for them every day. Folks, I'm telling you, if you've been married 40 years and all you can say at the end of 40 years is, I'm so glad we made it, that's for the birds. That is not at all what God wanted you to enjoy. He wants it to be explosive. He wants it to be awesome. He wants it to be the most amazing thing ever. And when you finish that ride, you say, hey, give me 50 more of those. Because God wanted it to be special. He made it special, customized for you. And if we don't model that with our children and let them know how important it is that we love our husbands and wives, if we don't model that for them every day, we're going to look up and they're going to seek pleasure in some other vein. My father, I'll wait for the collective gasp here in just a moment. My father taught his children about sex at the age of 6. You can go ahead now. 6 years old. Now, some people say, that's crazy. But I'll tell you this, and I don't say this with any bragging, it's by the grace of God. All 4 of my parents' children were virgins when they got married. Their first sexual experience was the night they got married. I don't know many people that can say that. They made it comfortable for us. They taught us on our level what we could understand, and as we grew older, they filled in more blanks to the point when I had questions, I went to my dad for those answers. We have a responsibility. And if we're going to be a family that's pleasing to God, we're going to teach them all of the things that God wants us to know and wants us to experience in life. And marriage is the greatest blessing that we can ever have in a person-to-person relationships on earth. And if we don't teach them that that's an honorable thing, that we need to hold it up in honor, then we're missing the boat. The hook's coming, I know it is. All right, I'll move on. There are lots of things that we could discuss. In Ephesians chapter 5, God gives us the most perfect model for what marriage should be. You know, he talks about how the wives are to submit themselves to their husbands, and the husbands are to love their wives as Christ loved the church and gave himself up for it. So there's this beautiful diagram, if you can see it in your mind, where, you know, the wife is here. And the word for submit is hupotasso. You probably have heard this before. It's a compound Greek word that gives the impression that someone would rank themselves under someone else. So the wives are to place themselves under the leadership of the husband. And the husband is to love his wife sacrificially. And I believe this with all my heart. When a man loves his wife the way he ought to love her, it's no problem for her to place herself under his leadership. And the more she places herself under his leadership and demonstrate that respect and trust, as God says there in Ephesians chapter 5, the easier it is for him to love her with all that he's got. The problem comes when we become self-absorbed about what our needs are and how they're not being met, and so we withhold that respect or we withhold that love, and it breaks the cycle and it twists it all around. And that's where dysfunction begins. But then I think about 1 Peter 3:7. Where the passage there talks about how the husbands are to live with their wives in an understanding way. Now, I hear most men, when I say that, when I read that verse, they go, that's got to be the hardest verse in all the Bible to understand a woman. But here's the thing, guys. It's not about understanding all women. It's about understanding your woman, right? It's just one. You know, in the biblical times, whenever the Israelites, a man was involved in the army and in the military there, whenever he got married, you know, he was given a full year so he may go and be with his wife and learn what makes her happy. We've got it all wrong with that honeymoon stuff, right? What was it, 6 or 7 days, something like that? And then we're back at home, back into the rigors. Think about what he's saying. Learn what it takes. Live with your wife in an understanding way. Now listen why this is important. Because it goes on to say that when you live with your wives in an understanding way, you're giving honor to her as the weaker vessel. Now, when it talks about that, a lot of times people get upset about it. Oh, what do you mean by weaker? Well, there's some physicality to it in that the bone structure and the muscle tissue and everything of a man is going to be a greater mass than a woman. And so there is something to that weaker vessel from the physical standpoint. But if you look deeper into that, what's being said is the woman's to be handled delicately, but not in the sense of she's fragile. She's to be held delicately in the sense of maybe like fine china. You know, in our house, we have china. I don't know why, because we never use it. But we do have it. I think something like 6 or 7 place settings. And they have their special place in the cabinet. And whenever they're brought out, like twice in our married life, I mean, it's like 2 hands, and it's like very careful, and you place it on the table very, very carefully. And if the kids get nearby, you pop them in the head, right? So it's real, they're real precious, right? Our everyday plates, it's like Frisbees, man. They would just toss them onto the table. But with china, it's different, right? Because we know they're expensive. We know they're valuable. And so we take care of them. And that's what's being asked of us, husbands, is to handle our wives, love them, and say, put them in their, I didn't say put them in their place. I said put them in their special place, right? A place of honor. Why? So that our prayers will not be hindered. My relationship to God is determined to some degree about how well I treat my wife. If we want to be a family that's pleasing to God, we got to get this stuff right. Now, there's plenty of other passages that deal with all those perversions, homosexuality and bestiality and a lot of other things, sexual immorality. There's several passages in Romans chapter 1, the passages in 1 Corinthians 6, Revelation chapter 21, lots of passages in Leviticus that deal with it. But if we just get it right and help them fall in love with the right model, think about how that could change the world. All right, I got like 7 minutes, and I got 10 more points. All right, a family that honors God or a family that's pleasing to God is going to maintain discipline and accountability. I love these passages. Some people don't like to hear them. But, you know, when the Bible deals so often with something, I think we can't look past it and say, well, that just must not be important in these times. Listen to what it says, Proverbs 22:6, train up a child in the way he should go, and when he is older, he will not depart from it. Now, we understand that to be a proverb. We understand that to be a guiding principle, that if we train up our children the way we should, then typically speaking, they're going to follow that path and go. But, you know, the devil is good, and he pulls a lot of people away, and people make decisions that are not upright. And so we've seen where people have been taught right and they fall away. But in general, that principle is true. Well, what does it mean? The word for train is dedicate. And the imagery there is of a trained servant. There are allusions to a hook and a jaw, like a fish, you know, like we got them. So I think the idea here is that there are parameters that are drawn around how we guide our children. We give them some freedom, but there are parameters. And when they get past those parameters, hey, we pull them back in, right? We keep them settled in. We build the walls. We give them the freedom within those walls. And we're training them. I found one commentary that said this. It says, make experienced as one does a horse by a rope in its mouth. And of course, we can think about James chapter 3, the passage that talks about the bits in the horse's mouth, how, you know, with that little bit, we can turn the horse wherever we want to go. So the idea is to train them, to give them the parameters, and to guide them within those parameters. Proverbs 22, verse 15, just a few verses later, says, foolishness is bound up in the heart of the child. The rod of discipline will remove it far from him. Proverbs 19:18, discipline your son, for there is hope. Do not set your heart on putting him to death. Now, the first time I read that, I thought what that's saying is, okay, discipline your child, but don't go over the top and kill him. But that's really not what this is saying. It's saying if we don't discipline, we're basically sending them on a path that leads to their destruction. Proverbs 23:13 and 14 says, don't withhold discipline from a child. If you strike him with the rod, he will not die. That's my parents' favorite one growing up. If you strike him with the rod, you will save his soul from Sheol. Proverbs 29, verse 15, verse 17. A rod and reproof bring wisdom, but a child left to himself brings shame on his mother. But on the flip side of this, verse 17 says, discipline your son, he will give you rest and delight. Man, how cool is it when our children do what's right? How fantastically peaceful is it when they choose to do the right thing and you get to sit by and watch them make that right choice? Oh, it's just too good. You know, people run away from these because it talks about this discipline, and it really does mean a rod. And you know, my wife, bless her heart, she learned right out of the gate that if she used a wooden spoon, it would scare our kids to death. But I have a child that was very cunning. And one day my wife went to grab one of those spoons to swat him on the backside. You know, one of those wooden spoons that you mix up mashed potatoes and stuff like that, right? She went to get her spoon and it was gone. She dug in other places. She had 6 or 7 wooden spoons and they were all gone. 2 guesses on where you think it was. Under his bed. Hidden. He had taken every one of them and hid them away from her. But you know, isn't Hebrews 12 kind of the passage that helps us understand that discipline is for our good? That God disciplines those who he loves? Isn't it that passage that helps us understand that we shouldn't turn away from that we should let it train us in righteousness? And obviously there's a limit where we can't get angry and we can't go overboard and we can't be abusive to our children. Because the Bible even says that the unholy anger of man does not produce the righteousness of God. But there is something to this, shaping our kids, training them, dedicating them to God because of the way we discipline them. I got like 3 minutes. I'll share with you my favorite story about my mother. Living in the same town with your grandparents is a beautiful thing if you're a child. Because whenever parents go out on dates, guess where you get to go? Grandparents. Guess what they do? Spoil you rotten. Guess what they do? Give you everything that you want. And guess what else they do? When you're bad, they lie. Okay? So when I'm growing up, my parents would go on these dates from time to time, and then they would ship us off to our grandparents. Well, my name was Bam Bam. That's what they called me growing up. And my grandmother that had always been on my side, when my parents came to pick us up one night, she betrayed me. And when my parents asked, well, how were they tonight? They said, well, little Bam Bam was pretty bad. So we're on the way home, and I get the talking through your teeth. Do you know what I'm talking about? When I get you home, I'm going to tear you from limb to limb. You know, I get that talk all the way home as I'm getting there. And we pull into the driveway, and I'm horrified. But I have been angelic in the back seat all the way there. I didn't touch anybody or didn't cause any kind of ruckus or anything. And my mom, and this is a miracle, my mom was reminded that she was supposed to bring a casserole to a lady, so we had to leave the driveway, go back to Kroger, pick up some stuff, and come back home. Well, guess what happened while we were at Kroger? My mom bumped into someone that she hadn't seen in 20 years, and that woman just made my mom feel like she was a princess. She said, Debbie, you look so beautiful. I haven't seen you in 20 years. You haven't aged one bit. Well, my mom went from outright rage of killing me to, she was so sweet. So on the way home, I'm back in the back thinking, this is going to work out good for me. So we get home, and true, she forgets. And they kind of pat me on the backside and said, go put your pajamas on and go to bed. Man, you've never seen a kid move so fast. I went to the bedroom, put on my pajamas, got in bed, pulled those covers over, turned off the lights, and went to sleep. I thought I had escaped. But at 2 o'clock in the morning, a bright light shone in my room when the door creaked open. There was a dark, shadowy figure that entered the doorway, and the devil walked into my room dressed like my mom. And she came and threw back the covers and said in demonic-like voice, "Thought I'd forget, didn't ya?" And she wore me out. Now, I'm almost 42 years old. I tell that story not to put my mother down. I tell that story because I'll never forget the lesson she taught me. 2 Corinthians chapter 5, verse 10 says, "For we must all appear before the judgment seat of Christ, and every one of us will give an answer for the things that we've done in the body, whether they be good or whether they be evil." And Hebrews 9:27 says that it is appointed unto man once to die, and after that the judgment. I thought I had escaped it, but my mom was as sure as the sunrise. And her discipline and her level of accountability that she required of us has taken me through life. Never be able to give her enough praise for what she taught me. And then finally, I know the hook's coming, is a family that wants to be pleasing to God shares with others. Galatians 6, Romans 12, Hebrews 13, 1 Peter 4. All of them talk about taking what God has blessed you with, this great life, this great Christian family that you've got, and you share it with the rest of the world. You be an influence. You have people over your home. You model it for others. Be an influence and be an example. If we do those things, we'll have families that are pleasing to God. Thank you guys for being here tonight.